The early morning wind swept across the withered grasslands on the outskirts of Pine Hollow, carrying the scent of dust and long-lost time. Weak sunlight filtered through a thin veil of mist, casting its light on a crumbling barn that stood isolated in a barren clearing. Once a horse training station, it was now just rotting posts and cracked walls, like forgotten memories left to decay. A patrol car rolled slowly up to the broken fence. Inside the vehicle, Officer Ethan Cole reached out to switch off the radio. His eyes landed on a smudged report. Locals reported strange noises under the old stables, likely just wild animals. Just another errand, he thought. But instinct told him not to ignore it. After all, it wasn't a coincidence he'd brought Bruno this morning. Bruno, German Shepherd, K9 Unit Number 83, sat with his head near the window, ears perked and nose twitching slightly as if catching something on the wind. Ethan glanced at him. 4 years on the job together, and Ethan still marveled at the way Bruno perceived the world, a strange fusion of wild instinct and near-human devotion. This dog never barked without reason. Ethan opened the car door, and Bruno leapt out like an arrow from a bow, but stopped short at the broken gate. He didn't go in. He just stood there, silent, nose to the ground, breathing deeply. Then suddenly he turned his head, locking eyes with Ethan. That look was no longer just an animal reflex. It held an urgent clarity, as if Bruno was waiting for a command to act. "Go," Ethan signaled, his hand resting lightly near his shoulder holster. The two slipped through the broken fence, stepping into a place where time had stopped. Grass grew through the floorboards. The roof peeled away like rotted skin. There was no sound but the wind. Yet Bruno picked up speed, legs low to the ground, nose down. His tail stiffened like an antenna catching a signal, every step taut as a bowstring at full draw. Then, suddenly, Bruno froze. He stood perfectly still over a shallow depression near the collapsed wall. Then he barked, a deep, resonant bark that shattered the silence like a church bell tolling in an abandoned cathedral. It wasn't just a signal. Ethan felt it in his spine. This was a warning. "Bruno, what is it?" Ethan whispered, stepping forward. Bruno turned, barked again, louder this time, his chest swelling with urgency, claws tearing at the dirt. His eyes weren't just looking. They were spotlights piercing the ground, as if he could hear something no one else could. Ethan knelt. The soil where Bruno stood had been disturbed. Its thin layer of dust didn't match the rest of the surroundings. No blood, no rot, but something still felt wrong. A quiet chill rose from the earth, like Ethan was standing at the threshold between life and death. And Bruno, somehow, was the one holding the gate. He retrieved a small digging tool from the car and began to dig. Bruno didn't move, eyes locked on the soil, his body stretched tight with every stroke of Ethan's hand. Then, a whimper, faint as a breath, from beneath the ground. Ethan froze. "Someone's down there," he shouted, fumbling for the radio to call for backup. His hands trembled. Bruno's didn't. The dog stood there, quiet and unwavering, like a marker placed over a buried truth. In this forgotten place, the bark of a dog had awakened something the town had long chosen to forget, that some souls never truly vanish. They wait for someone brave enough to listen. And Bruno, with just that one bark, chose to be the first to answer. Bruno didn't move. He stood stiff in front of a patch of uneven soil beside the crumbling wall, his body tight like a string pulled to its final tension. The morning mist lingered. The wind still whispered across the scorched grasslands. But in that moment, the world around him seemed to pause. It was just him and the silent earth beneath, calling out in a voice only Bruno could hear. The way he tilted his head, ears alert, nose twitching, it wasn't reflex. It was a reception. He was tuning into something invisible, something that didn't belong to this world, vague, urgent, undeniable. Ethan knew Bruno's every move, from the way his breathing changed at the scent of blood to how he crouched low when nearing a target. But today, Bruno's eyes were different. They weren't the eyes of a tool. They were the eyes of a being who had taken on responsibility beyond any handler's command. And then, without waiting for an order, Bruno began to dig. The first paw strike sent damp soil flying into Ethan's face. The second hit harder, scattering bits of rock. His claws sliced through hardened earth like they meant to break through time itself. There was no blood, no scent of decay, but Ethan's heart raced. "Bruno, wait, what are you seeing?" he called, rushing to the spot. Bruno didn't answer. He kept digging, faster now, each claw a blow against the silence. He barked in between, not randomly, but in rhythm, as if he were sending a message. "I hear it. Do you?" Ethan knelt beside him, pressed a hand to the dirt, and felt something off. The soil was newer here, softer, recently turned, and clumsily refilled. Beneath it wasn't shattered tile like the rest, but a layer of rotted wood, covered with debris and thick dust. Someone had buried something here, not as construction, but as a hurried cover-up, a burial of guilt. Bruno stopped. He pressed his snout to the earth, took a deep breath. His eyes narrowed. A soft moan echoed from below, barely a second long, but enough to send ice down Ethan's spine. Someone was down there! Ethan's body locked in place for a heartbeat. His hand instinctively gripped the small shovel at his waist. He looked at Bruno, who now sat beside him, no longer barking, digging, just waiting. It felt strange, like Bruno wasn't the one following orders anymore. He was giving them. No words, but the look said it all. "Hurry, they're not going to last much longer." Ethan ran to the car, called emergency services on the priority channel, and rushed back to dig. Bruno joined him, digging alongside despite raw, reddened paws, despite dirt caking his face. It was as if stopping would break something inside him. Not from instinct, but from duty. Ethan remembered one October night 2 years ago. Bruno had only been with the team for 3 months. They were searching for a missing girl near the forest's edge. Rain had washed out the tracks. Ethan, misjudging the path, led Bruno away from the probable zone. The next morning they found the girl's body, just 50 meters from where Bruno had frozen the night before. Since that day, Bruno had never barked at anything, and Ethan had never doubted him again. Now, in front of him, this same dog was wagering everything. Each bark, each claw, in a slim hope that someone below was still breathing. Each tile pried loose, each plank pulled away, was a silent prayer. Don't let us be too late again. Bruno whimpered, low and tight, like it hurt to make the sound. Ethan looked over, saw the blood soaking the fur around his paws. Still, Bruno didn't stop. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder, gently. "It's okay. I've got it from here. You've done enough, warrior." But Bruno wouldn't leave. He sat beside Ethan, eyes locked on the patch of earth now opened, like a soldier guarding the mouth of hell, ready to trade himself for someone else's return to the light. Beneath that broken ground, a frail heart was still beating, and Bruno's bark had heard it first. The rescue truck screeched to a halt at the edge of the sunken land, dust rising into the mist that hadn't yet cleared. Doors flew open as uniformed responders in red jumped out with digging tools, ropes, and a soft stretcher. Leading them was Lieutenant Garver, who needed only a moment to assess the situation before striding toward Ethan. "Someone's down there?" he asked, urgent but calm. Ethan nodded hard, still gripping the mud-covered shovel. Bruno heard a moan. A man is very weak. There was no time to question why anyone would trust a dog's instinct. One look at the soil clawed raw by bloodied paws, and at Bruno's unwavering gaze by the edge of the hole, and they knew. This was real. One rescuer dropped to her knees and placed a seismic sensor. The screen flickered slowly, then blurred before displaying a faint signal. Irregular, but rhythmic. "He's breathing!" the technician cried. "There's a heartbeat, weak, but it's there." Bruno didn't bark. He lay flat at the edge of the hole, head tilted slightly, as if guarding the fragile gate between two worlds. Every time the drill drew closer, he would lift his head, eyes part alert, part pleading, as if to say, "Careful, he's close. He's fragile." The rescue team worked non-stop. When machines weren't enough, they dug by hand. Every rotted plank was removed, wrapped in cloth, and avoided a jarring impact. Ethan stayed by their side, still digging. Sweat drenched his forehead, and mud soaked his back. Every breath the earth exhaled felt like a dull ache tightening in his chest. Bruno remained steady as stone, letting out only the faintest whine when someone veered off course, a strained, sorrowful warning. And then, wood cracked. A gap appeared nearly a meter deep. Flashlight swept across the dense darkness. Inside, a trembling arm reached up. Thin, bruised, coated in dust. Fingers twitched, nails chipped, and blood-caked. "There's someone here!" The shout came, almost in chorus. Ethan stepped back to give them room, his heart stuck in his throat. Bruno didn't move, just slowly turned his head. There, that exact spot. He had been right all along. Two rescuers donned oxygen masks. One crawled in waist-deep, checked the man's pulse and breath, then waved urgently. "Stretcher, move fast, his heart's fading." In the flickering amber lights of the rescue truck, the man's body was lifted slowly, delicately, like retrieving an ancient relic from the ruins. His uniform was tattered and caked with mud, belt hanging loose, chest strap still bearing a faded dog tag. As the light caught it, Ethan read the name clearly. Sergeant David Rourke. He stood frozen. On the stretcher, David breathed with difficulty, his throat letting out garbled sounds. His eyes stayed shut, face sunken to the point of being a shadow of the missing person file photo. No one could explain how he'd survived 3 years of vanishing, but none of it mattered now. What mattered was, he was still alive. Bruno stepped forward. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He gently placed a paw on the stretcher's edge, then lowered his head to softly nudge the limp fingers hanging down, as if to say, "You've made it back to the surface." David flinched. His eyes didn't open, but his fingers curled inward, touching Bruno's muzzle. A ripple of silence spread through the chaotic noise of the rescue. Ethan leaned in close, catching the faintest murmur from David's lips. "He heard me." Ethan swallowed hard. No protocol manual described this, only trust. And somehow Bruno had heard something no human ear ever could. The ambulance rolled away. While others rushed to file reports, take photos, and pack up equipment, only Bruno remained, seated by the hole, eyes fixed on the earth that had nearly claimed a life. Ethan walked over and sat beside him, saying nothing. Together they stared at the damp soil, the silence that had almost buried a man alive, if not for a loyalty too strong to ignore. In a loud and indifferent world, it was a dog, wordless, uncredentialed, who had become the one to truly hear a cry from the depths. And the most extraordinary thing, Bruno had never looked away. The ambulance disappeared around the final bend of the dirt road, leaving behind a haze of dust that settled over broken stones, crumbled bricks, and the freshly dug ground. For a moment, the world seemed to return to its original state. Silent, chaotic, ruined, just as they had found it. But no one in the rescue crew noticed that one being had not left. Bruno stood there, alone. He no longer barked or clawed at the earth like before. The K9 dog simply sat quietly beside the deep hole from which the broken body of the soldier had been raised. His eyes, amber, calm as still water, remained fixed on the space now exposed in the soil, as if something down there was still unresolved. Some sound only he could hear. The wind rustled past his ears, carrying the scent of scorched grass, damp earth, and a trace of blood. A scent Bruno had known many times on past missions. But this time, he didn't react as a trained tool. There was no reflex, no command, only a primal, unwavering instinct. Ethan stood behind him, leash in hand but not clipped to Bruno's collar. He knew the dog wouldn't run. Not now. not while something inside him remained unfinished. It was as if Bruno's heart was tethered to that piece of earth by a thread no praise or medal could cut. "You're not leaving yet, are you?" Ethan whispered. There was no reply. Bruno only turned his head slightly, a subtle motion, not asking permission but reminding. "You see, it's not over yet." Ethan let out a long, weary breath. What they had uncovered today surpassed every expectation. A missing soldier thought to be a traitor, buried not by mistake, but perhaps by silence, injustice, or something darker still. And the one who brought him back wasn't forensics, nor justice. It was the instinct of a dog thought to merely follow orders. At the county hospital, where white lights and machine beeps filled the emergency room, David Rourke fought to hold on to a reality he could barely remember. His pale face reflected the overhead glow. Dry lips mumbling incomprehensible words. Nurses moved quickly. Ventilators, IVs, monitors. Then they all paused when Bruno entered the room. No one stopped him. Not a single protest. He walked through the open door, his steps quiet, as if they belonged there. No growls, no pawing. He simply approached the bedside where David lay, tangled in wires and tubes. Bruno stood for a moment, gazing at him, long and deeply. There was something silent and unknowable in his eyes. Then, softly, he raised a paw, rested it on the edge of the bed, and lowered his muzzle to touch the soldier's frail hand. And then, the unexpected happened. David shuddered. A long breath escaped his throat. His eyes opened, slow, weak, clouded like waking from a deep, dark dream. But when they met Bruno, something in David's face softened. His hand-curled fingers moved, searching, and found Bruno's head. No petting, no grip, just a simple touch, an affirmation that they were both still here. "He heard me," David whispered. "I didn't deserve saving, but he knew." Bruno made no other sound. He simply lay there, eyes calm, as if he had never barked or clawed or bled. And in that silence, everyone in the room, though they couldn't explain it, understood something deeper than survival had taken place. Ethan entered last, quietly. He saw Bruno by the bed, David whispering something lost in the air, and suddenly all the noise in the room seemed to fall away. There were still countless unanswered questions, but in that moment, none mattered more than this. He came back. Ethan stepped forward, laid a hand on Bruno's head, and stroked the trembling spine beneath his fur. That touch, warm, alive, weighty, felt like reaching into an unfinished story. A story where the hero was not a man. "You're a hero," he whispered, "and you knew something we were too afraid to believe." Bruno never took his eyes off David, as if still standing guard over a memory not yet healed. Because for him, rescue was never just pulling someone out of a hole. It was bringing them back to themselves. Morning at the hospital began with the familiar chorus, the steady beep of heart monitors, the squeak of gurney wheels on tiled floors, and the soft whistle of wind through a half-open window. But in the last room down the hall, where slanted sunlight spilled across white sheets, the air felt heavier, still, like something there had yet to be properly named. David had fallen asleep after that moment, that inexplicable touch between man and dog. His sleep looked like a surrender after 3 years of strain, but it wasn't peaceful. His brow furrowed slightly, lips murmuring through the haze of dreams, as though the shadows of memory were still tugging at the edges of his fragile revival. Bruno remained close. He lay at the foot of the bed, chin resting on his front paws, eyes half closed but ears twitching subtly with every sound in the room. Not guarding others, but listening for something inside David. A voice not yet spoken. Ethan sat nearby, eyes locked on the hospital's digital records open on a nearby laptop. He'd started searching the night before, after seeing the name on David's dog tag. A professional reflex. But the more he read, the more unease twisted in his chest. Status: missing suspected voluntary desertion. Military file closed on November 4th. Case transferred to non-pursuit classification. Final note, no signs of capture or coercion. Ethan leaned closer to the screen, eyes scanning the cold, clinical lines. Every word felt typed from assumption, not evidence. And he knew the military didn't let a name fade without reason, unless someone wanted it to disappear. He looked at David, still hovering between fever dreams and sedative fog. One of David's hands twitched faintly, like it was tapping on the invisible door between past and present. Ethan spoke quietly, almost without realizing. "There's something wrong here." Bruno opened his eyes. He lifted his head, looked at Ethan, not to ask, but to confirm. A slight tilt, ears perked, his body leaning subtly toward the bed, as if saying, "You see it too, don't you?" A few minutes later, David opened his eyes for the second time. This time they were clearer, sharper, like he'd swum up from beneath a thick layer of fog. The first thing he saw was Bruno, and a soft smile crept across his face, not wide, but full of gratitude. Then he turned to Ethan. "You're a cop?" David asked, his voice low and rasping. Ethan nodded. "I'm a special response officer. Rescue task force. I didn't think I'd find a living soldier buried under a rotted horse stable." David gave a dry chuckle, his gaze dimming. "I didn't think anyone would come looking." Silence passed between them. Then David continued, "I remember not clearly. The day I disappeared. Someone called me from the rear base. I stepped out. Someone was waiting in a truck. I never saw his face. He wore a mask." Ethan held his breath. "Then what?" "Something jabbed my neck. Not sleep, it burned. Like fire inside me. Then darkness. I woke up tied up. No idea where. And it just kept going day after day." He spoke through labored breaths, voice trembling, memories muffled like they'd been smothered by years of sedation. Ethan didn't speak, but Bruno stood and stepped closer. He rested his head on the edge of the bed, locking eyes with David, as if pulling every shard of truth from the haze. David glanced down and exhaled. "He knows. I saw it in his eyes. He recognized me before I even knew if I was still myself." Bruno didn't blink. In his gaze, there was no fear, no judgment. Only one thing. Memory. A memory that had never betrayed. Ethan jotted down every word. But he knew. The name David Rourke didn't simply vanish from the record, unless someone had made it vanish. He turned back to the file on the screen, scrolling down to the field labeled Authorized Closure Officer. One name appeared, Mallory Richard, Captain Bravo Sector Commander. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He remembered that name. A man once commended for leadership and once accused of corruption, but never formally charged. Not then. He looked back at Bruno, still standing guard like a silent sentinel, never breaking eye contact with the man he had waited for. Bruno tilted his head once more, as if he, too, felt the shift. "We've stumbled onto something bigger, haven't we?" No one answered. But the silence between man and dog rang like a vow. This name won't be erased again. The pale mid-morning light filtered through the pine woods on the edge of Pine Hollow, shards of brightness slicing through the trees like wounds over an unhealed memory. Ethan drove in silence, his hands tightening slightly around the steering wheel. The name Richard Mallory still echoed in his mind, not just a line on a military form. It was a fracture, and behind it, Ethan sensed something rotten. Beside him, Bruno remained upright in the passenger seat, not lying down as he usually did. His eyes scanned every curve of the road, every sign, as if, deep in his instincts, he knew this wasn't just any destination. "She's David's sister," Ethan said softly, almost speaking to the wind. "The only one left." Bruno didn't react. But when the car turned down a dirt road toward a small, ivy-covered house, the dog suddenly leaned forward, ears alert, eyes fixed. His chest rose and fell. A low, almost nostalgic whimper slipped from his throat. Not from caution, but memory. Ethan slowed. "You remember this place?" Bruno looked at him, then back at the house. Silent. The look needed no translation. It held the shape of unspoken recognition. as if he'd once waited by that wooden door, but had never been let in again. The door opened on the second ring of the bell. A woman appeared, early 30s, dark brown hair pinned back at the nape of her neck. Her face was unpainted, her skin pale but firm, and her eyes, gray and sharp, belonged to someone long used to grief. She looked at Ethan first, wary, unapologetic, but her eyes quickly fell on Bruno. The dog didn't bark, didn't wag his tail, didn't move forward. He just sat, still, as if memory itself had taken shape. For a moment, Elena's face changed. Her eyes widened. Her lips moved wordlessly. A shadow from the past stirred, like the door of time creaking open for just that look. "Bruno," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe her voice. Bruno took a step forward, then stopped. He didn't rush, didn't press in like a dog reuniting with family. He waited. He asked for permission. And then, in a motion of pure grace, he lowered his head and gently touched his muzzle to the back of her still hand. Elena froze. She let them in without asking why. Not because she believed them, but because she couldn't ignore those eyes. The eyes of a dog that didn't know how to lie. The living room was worn, filled with the scent of dried mint and books. A family photo, parents and 2 siblings, still sat on the mantel, but the frame of David had been turned face down. A denial, or a long-delivered sentence. "David's alive," Ethan said bluntly. "We found him buried under the ruins at Pine Hollow." Elena went rigid. She stood unmoving, hand gripping the chair as if to steady herself. "That can't be true. He was drugged, kidnapped, and kept underground for 3 years, Ethan added, showing her hospital photos and medical records. His file says voluntary disappearance, but it was his dog, Bruno, who never stopped searching. Elena didn't look at the papers. Her gaze stayed on Bruno, still sitting at her feet. His eyes now carried no memory, but invitation. Listen again. Not with logic, but with heart. "My parents died in regret," she said, voice breaking. "They believed he ran. Cowardice, betrayal. They never forgave him, spoke to me again, because I still believed he was taken." Bruno stood, stepped forward, and rested his head on her lap. A gentle touch. Dry, quiet, not begging, but one that made her shoulders shake, and the tears fell. "Only him," she whispered. "Only Bruno remembered who David was." Ethan rested his hand on the back of the chair. "I need your help, Elena. There's something in David's past he's trying to tell us, but his memory is fragmented. You're the last one who holds a full picture of who he was." Elena wiped her tears. She sat, running her hand down Bruno's back, searching for a heartbeat she knew. "He once told me, if anything happens, don't trust the paperwork. The truth doesn't always live in reports. It lives in the eyes of those who see it. And now I see." She turned to Ethan, voice steady. "Tell me what I need to do." By the time Ethan left, the sun was dipping low. Warm honey light bathed the steps of the porch. Elena stood in the doorway, her hand still on Bruno's head, not in doubt, but in grateful farewell. Ethan opened the door. Bruno jumped into the seat like he'd done it 100 times. But before the car pulled away, he turned and looked back at Elena. Those amber eyes quiet, as if engraving the image of someone who once turned away, but now had learned how to forgive. As Ethan's off-road vehicle pulled away from the shadowed house veiled in ferns, late afternoon light began to thin across the treetops. The forest wind slipped through the cracked window, carrying with it the scent of dry pine and damp soil, the signature smell of Pine Hollow in late spring. Intense, but laced with something unsaid. Ethan didn't glance at Bruno, but he felt the shift. Since leaving Elena's home, the K9 had remained upright in the passenger seat, not lying down like he usually did. His eyes were locked straight ahead, not with tension, but as if retracing an old road, one that hadn't let him go. "You know we have to go back, don't you?" Ethan said quietly, not expecting an answer. Bruno didn't bark. He only tilted his head slightly, then looked forward again. An unspoken agreement. Pine Hollow in the twilight blurred like a faded photograph. The collapsed stable, once the site of David's rescue, was now roped off with yellow tape. No officers remained. They had concluded their part. But not Bruno. As soon as Ethan opened the car door, Bruno leapt out without command. He ran along the western wall, the area neglected due to prior collapse. His eyes scanned swiftly, nose pressed to the earth, following layers of disturbed dirt and overlooked signs, scratches in time from 3 years ago. Ethan followed, flashlight in hand, its beam narrow and pale. But tonight, the light wouldn't come from a tool. It came from a living memory, walking on 4 legs ahead of him. Bruno stopped at what looked like a meaningless patch of wall, just cracked bricks and thick dust, yet he wouldn't look away. He sat, pawed gently at the bricks, then stopped, waiting. Ethan knelt, pressed his hand to the wall, and heard it. A faint, hollow echo. Clack! A loose brick. Ethan nudged it. It slid free, revealing a hidden cavity inside the wall. There, buried under years of dust, lay a dark gray metal box, rusted lock, old security seal, but intact. Ethan, now gloved, gently pulled it out. Neither he nor Bruno spoke. They both knew. This wasn't supposed to be found. Under flashlight glow, Ethan pried the box open. Inside, a thick stack of documents wrapped in military-grade waterproof plastic. The paper edges had yellowed, but the typewritten lines remained crisp. Stamped in red ink at the top corner. Project HLH, top secret, red stripe clearance only. Below, a handwritten note. Open only if the commanding officer is missing or neutralized. Do not release to personnel outside the program. Ethan held his breath. He'd heard whispers of HLH before, scraps of rumors during security briefings, quickly redacted leaks. A black project rumored to test neural suppressants, not to enhance soldier strength, but to erase resistance. To control obedience by chemically severing free will. You've seen this before, haven't you, Bruno? Ethan whispered. Bruno sat still, silent, but the way he stared at the file, body taut like bracing for a blow, it told Ethan all he needed. Bruno hadn't forgotten. He couldn't, because this place, this secret, was once shared with David. A soldier silenced for knowing too much. Ethan flipped through the early pages. Clinical logs, test results, lists of volunteers with no public records. The start dates matched exactly with the day David vanished. And then, a name that froze Ethan's hand mid-turn. Lead Technical Officer, Mallory R. Ethan's heart pounded. He looked at Bruno, who had edged closer to the box, drawn to the name like gravity. In the dog's eyes, something deeper than fear stirred, something like a memory too painful to stay buried. Bruno suddenly stood, walked to the room's far corner, where a broken tile clung to an old patch of faded green paint. He sniffed, whimpered softly, and pawed at the concrete below. Ethan followed, and found not an object but a stain, a dried patch of blood, old dark brown, spread thin like a silenced scream. Bruno turned back to him. You're trying to tell me David wasn't just buried here, Ethan said. He was tortured here first. Bruno didn't respond. He didn't have to. His gaze was solemn, absolute. On the drive away from Pine Hollow, Ethan held the box in his arms like it contained not just evidence, but a truth denied for too long. Bruno leaned his head against Ethan's leg, eyes gently closing, as if he too carried the weight of a chapter that should never have been written. Ethan thought of David, of the way he looked at Bruno, of his words at the hospital. I didn't deserve saving, but he knew. Now Ethan understood. Bruno didn't know. He remembered. And that memory, loyal, tireless, unwilling to go quiet, was the only key that could break through the walls built to hide what no one wanted to see. In the amber-lit room, shadows flickered against the walls as Ethan sat at his desk. The metal box lay cracked open beside him like a wound that had yet to close. The classified files sat motionless among scattered papers, but Ethan couldn't read another line. Bruno lay beneath the desk, ears relaxed but eyes open. He wasn't sleeping. There was something in the air, something no radar or monitor could detect, but it stirred his heart all the same. Ethan reached for a glass of water, then stopped. His gaze drifted, not to the room, but back in time, to a forest, a cry, a choice he couldn't forget. It was a year ago, in a small town nearly 200 miles from Pine Hollow. A 6-year-old boy went missing during a family camping trip. The search team launched immediately. Ethan led the mission with Bruno, then just 4 years old. It was a foggy night. Every sound was muffled. The scent of wet roots and anxious breath filled the air. Bruno caught a trail, tugged Ethan left toward a steep, rocky hill. But Ethan had hesitated. The terrain didn't match the heat maps. The boy couldn't have made it that far. "No, Bruno, this way," he'd said, leash in hand. Bruno had paused, then turned, obedient. He didn't bark, didn't resist. 7 hours later, the second team expanded the perimeter. They found the boy unconscious beside a stream, exactly where Bruno had led. Dehydrated, hypothermic, alive, but with permanent neurological damage from oxygen loss. After that, Bruno wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond. He sat by the window, staring at the forest, where he should have barked. Ethan had held him close in the dark. "It's not your fault, Bruno, it's mine." But no words, no matter how kind, could erase the guilt etched into that silence. Bruno hadn't barked, because he obeyed, and a life nearly slipped away because of it. Back in the present, Ethan looked down. Bruno lay at his feet, eyes fixed on the hallway leading to David's room. That gaze, alert, steady, was no longer that of a working dog on duty. It belonged to a soul who had made a mistake, one who would never allow himself to fail again. Ethan stood. "Let's go, buddy." No second command needed. Bruno rose and padded softly down the corridor, every step placed as if walking on sacred ground. Outside David's door, he didn't bark. He tapped the frame once with his paw, a knock from someone who had learned to wait for permission. Ethan opened the door. The bedside lamp cast a faint glow on David's sweat-slicked face. He was breathing hard, fists clenched in the sheets. Caught in a nightmare. Bruno didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, lifted himself slightly, and rested his head on David's chest, right above his heart. No pressure, no noise, just a single touch, gentle as air, but heavy with meaning. David opened his eyes, breath ragged, but when he saw those brown eyes looking back at him, he stilled, as if something inside had been lit again. He croaked, throat dry. "I don't know if I deserve this." Bruno didn't move. His breathing was calm. His eyes are warm. No questions, no expectations. Only one silent answer. "I'm here, because this time I barked, and I won't leave until you're heard." David's hand trembled upward, resting on Bruno's head. A quiet sob escaped him. Not from pain, but from forgiveness. Not given by people, but by the one soul who never kept score, only carried the burden and healed it with loyalty. Ethan stood at the doorway, fists clenched, watching. In that moment he saw it clearly. Bruno was not just a dog. He was the symphony of every silence turned into action, every failure turned into resolve, every redemption forged through unwavering devotion. This time Bruno had barked. He had found the living, and this time he wouldn't let the world forget. Dawn crept softly through the hospital window, pale streaks of light slanting across the cold tile floor, gliding over the white wall and stopping at the edge of the bed where Bruno lay. He hadn't slept, not once during the night. He merely shifted position to keep his eyes within David's line of sight, like a small lantern guarding against the return of a terrible dream. David was still breathing steadily, no longer gasping, but sweat glistened on his brow. At the corners of his lips, he murmured inaudibly, lost in some wordless dialogue with himself. Outside the glass door, Ethan stood holding a copy of the documents pulled from the box the night before. His eyes held a tension, torn between the duties of an investigator and the convictions of a man beginning to believe in truths no file would dare declare. A nurse stepped out gently. "He's awake." The first name he asked for was Bruno. Ethan nodded, quietly entered. Bruno lifted his head, tail wagged once, but he didn't move. He knew David still needed him there a little longer. The room was quiet, the IV dripping in slow, steady rhythm. David opened his eyes, breathing shallow and calm. When he saw Ethan enter, he didn't flinch. There was no surprise, no guarded reaction, only a gaze like he'd already seen this moment in a long-forgotten dream. Ethan sat down beside him and slid the document forward. The cover bore bold, dried blood red letters. Black Corridor Program, top secret, do not duplicate outside gray zone. David closed his eyes. Silence. Bruno gently rested his muzzle on David's hand, as if to say, "It's time." "You were part of it, weren't you?" Ethan asked softly. David nodded, slowly, like the motion itself pulled up a buried life. "Hodge, it wasn't a unit. It was a labyrinth, a door opened by fear." His voice rasped, dry as sand, but each word cut clean like a blade. "At first, they told us we were chosen for our resilience, the unbreakables. But they weren't testing to confirm it, they were testing to break it." Ethan sat in stunned silence. David went on, "A bunker. No light, no sound. They drugged us, then isolated us. When I woke up, I could only hear breathing, not sure if it was mine or someone else's. Every day was another test. Psychological, memory, instinct, until you no longer knew who you were." He covered his face, fingers trembling slightly. Bruno nudged his hand gently. An unspoken comfort. "They deemed me unfit, too sentimental, too attached, too human. One night, they said I was being discharged. Then I blacked out. And after that, only darkness." Ethan clenched his fists. "The man who signed your removal was Richard Mallory." David's brow twitched, but there was no shock. He always wore a mask in the lab, always stayed behind glass. But I remember the voice. Every word like a barbed hook. Cold, hollow, and I'll never forget the way he said it. "Emotion is garbage on the battlefield." Bruno lifted his head. His eyes, wide, focused, weren't reacting. They were remembering. Ethan glanced at him, then back at David. "You and Bruno, you were in there together, weren't you?" David nodded. "He wasn't a unit dog. He was a parallel subject. They wanted to study emotional bonding between man and animal. We were the control pair, but they didn't anticipate the depth of that bond." Ethan froze. "That's why you were unfit?" "Yes," David whispered. "Because I refused to order Bruno to attack an unarmed civilian during the final test. I wouldn't turn him into a weapon." His voice cracked. "And for that, we were erased." Bruno stepped forward now, gaze locked on David, as if to say, "You did the right thing. You always did." Ethan rose, hand resting on Bruno's head. "Then this is where we start." He looked back at David. "I don't just want to clear your name. I want to destroy what locked you, and Bruno, inside that darkness for 3 years." David nodded, a faint light flickering behind his weary eyes. "I still have a recording. I don't know how they missed it. It's inside Bruno's old backup collar, from the day we were separated." Ethan looked at Bruno. The old collar still hung at his neck, but now Ethan noticed the nearly invisible seam, the subtle weight of something hidden. Hope was never gone. It had only been buried, like David, like Bruno's silenced memories. And now everything was resurfacing, through eyes, through claw marks, through a quiet touch of loyalty. Evening fell as Ethan sat once again at his desk, the tiny memory chip from Bruno's collar resting silently beside his laptop. He'd just listened to the recording, a short excerpt, but one that echoed with the weight of something buried too long. Voices, cold, bureaucratic, detached, but beneath every syllable was a scream that had never been allowed out. Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting downward to Bruno, seated by his feet, head tilted, that familiar quietude shimmering in his eyes. "You heard it, didn't you, Bruno?" Ethan whispered. Bruno didn't react, but the way he blinked slowly, leaned toward the chip. It was enough. It was confirmation. He remembered, and that memory had never dulled. Ethan's fingers tightened. As he flipped through the photocopied documents again, a name reappeared, like ink rising under heat. Marcus Keller. "Marcus," Ethan muttered, barely audible, and turned back to the laptop. He typed the name into the military archive system. It was rare. Results popped up faster than expected, and what he saw chilled him. Only 3 matches, only one with a photo. A young soldier. Sharp eyes, spine straight as steel. Graduated from the same elite program as David Rourke. Name, Marcus Keller. Rank, Sergeant Unit, Special Operations, Psychological Warfare. Trial Program HLT status, discharged, medical, severe post-program trauma. Note, transferred to Cedar Ridge Recovery Facility, not reintegrated. Ethan paused as he read. Cedar Ridge. A name he had never encountered in any current investigative system. A military medical facility that didn't appear on any modern map. He opened the satellite map, typed Cedar Ridge. Nothing. But after overlaying archived data layers from 2003, he finally spotted a location deep within the Black Hollow Mountains, near the state border, marked only as Behavioral Research Facility, decommissioned 2011. "A forgotten place," Ethan murmured. By then, Bruno had already stood up. He stepped toward the computer screen and lightly tapped his nose to the corner of Marcus's profile photo. A gesture that could have been random, but made Ethan freeze. As if Bruno had just confirmed, "I know this man." Ethan pulled out his phone and called David. "Do you know Marcus Keller?" A moment of silence. Then David's voice came through, hoarse, choked. "He was the first one taken from me in HLD, not because he was weak, but because he fought back. Marcus shouted in their faces when he saw me restrained. I remember his voice. 'Don't touch my teammate.' 3 days later, he vanished. I never saw him again." Ethan took a deep breath and spoke slowly. "I think he's still alive, David, and I think he knows more than we ever imagined." That night, in a room lit only by a desk lamp and Bruno's quiet breath, Ethan laid everything out. He unfolded an old military paper map and traced a route to Cedar Ridge, a place that had once existed and then been erased. No patient records, no transfer logs, only a single entry in the archives. Marcus Keller, unsuitable for reintegration. Status, isolated due to behavioral bonding with species K9. Ethan froze. Bonding with species K9? He turned to Bruno. Their eyes met for a brief, wordless moment. Of course, these weren't just trained dogs, and they weren't just soldiers. They were pair, bonded by something beyond language, loyalty and sacrifice. And maybe, like David, Marcus had his own Bruno. Or maybe this Bruno had once seen Marcus taken. Maybe, deep inside the memory that had been suppressed, the image had never truly faded. The next morning, Ethan packed his bag, printed the map, and gave Bruno a signal. Bruno stepped forward without hesitation. He didn't need to know where they were going, or what waited there. He just needed to go with the one who understood him, and help find those he had never forgotten. Inside the SUV, as the vehicle rolled toward the Black Hollow forest, Ethan glanced at Bruno in the rearview mirror. "We'll find Marcus," he said quietly. "And this time, no one stays buried." Bruno raised his head. His gaze was calm, but deep within it, a fire had begun to burn. The sky above Pine Hollow shifted slowly into a slate-gray hush as Ethan closed the SUV door and exhaled, preparing to head out with Bruno. This wasn't a typical mission. His instincts were loud. This wasn't just about finding the living. They were digging through a silence thick with lime and orders, where truths had been buried, sealed, and forgotten. Bruno jumped into the back seat without being called. He'd been waiting by the vehicle, as if he understood today's journey might not have a return route. His eyes gleamed in the dim morning light, still as water before a storm. Ethan started the engine, steering away from the sleepy town blocks. But they had barely gone a few streets when the German shepherd in the back began to stir restlessly. Bruno didn't whine. He didn't bark. But his ears shot up, his body tensed, and his eyes flicked behind them through the rear window. Not fear, pure, conditioned alertness, etched into his muscle memory from combat zones long past. "What is it, Bruno?" Ethan asked, glancing in the rear view. Bruno didn't turn his head, but his stare was all the answer needed. Ethan eased off the gas and pulled into an old service stop on the town's edge, once a repair station, now just a shell with crumbling pavement and vines creeping over its bones. He needed to check the vehicle. But more than that, something inside him said, "You don't keep driving like nothing's wrong." Bruno's shift wasn't random. As soon as the car stopped, Bruno leapt from the back seat, no command needed. He moved straight toward a dusty gray sedan parked 2 spaces over. Silent, methodical. His body low, steps slow, nose to the ground, pure canine tracking posture. Ethan followed quietly, heart hammering. The sedan was empty, windows fogged. The license plate was barely legible under layers of grime, like it had been intentionally obscured. Bruno stopped beside the driver's door, sniffed carefully, then moved to the front wheel. And then, a sound. Low. Rumbled from deep in his chest. A warning growl. Thunder before lightning. Ethan knew that sound. Bruno only growled like that when he detected trauma markers. He'd once caught chemical traces of explosives under a child's fingernails, blood cloaked by bleach on a concrete floor. And now, he had found something. Ethan knelt beside him and caught the faint trace of a chemical odor. Midazolam. Not the regular kind. A specialized variation. Clinical, sterile, with a bitter vapor burn. Used in extreme scenarios. Neurological suppression. Forced compliance. Ethan's chest tightened. This scent from HLD. Bruno whimpered. Soft, subtle, just for Ethan. He took a half step back, eyes fixed on the tinted window. No one inside. But someone had waited here. Watched. Marked them. Ethan rose, scanning the surroundings. No shadows moved, but he knew. They didn't need to be visible. Their message had been left in scent. "They know we're investigating," he muttered. Bruno turned back toward their vehicle, his tail lowered, not from fear, but because he had shifted into combat mode. He had survived the HLD program, had learned how to wait in silence. And now he was drawing on those hardened instincts once more, this time to protect Ethan, just as he once had with David. Back in the car, Ethan said nothing, but their eyes met in the rearview mirror, a silent vow passing between them. "We're not backing down." Ethan steered off onto a side road, avoiding the main route into the mountains. He changed the course, partly to throw off any tail, to buy time in case they were being tracked. At a secluded stretch of forest, he pulled over, stepped out, and opened the rear hatch and cabin. Bruno leapt down beside him, nose working every angle, sniffing the hinges, the creases between leather seats and floor mats. And then he stopped. Near the rear wheel there was a small crevice. Ethan crouched down, and there it was. A device no bigger than a finger, stuck on with specialized magnetic adhesive. No blinking lights, no sound, but it was active. "They planted a tracker," Ethan muttered through clenched teeth. He pulled on gloves, carefully removed the device, sealed it inside a metal container, and flung it far into a nearby river. Then he turned back to the car and gently patted Bruno's shoulder. "Good job, kid." Bruno didn't wag his tail. He simply exhaled, eyes fixed on the underbrush where the device had vanished. He knew this wasn't a game of hide and seek. This was war, and this time, they were the hunted. Dusk was falling by the time they neared the outskirts of Black Hollow. The path narrowed, and cell reception began to fade in and out. But Bruno seemed to shift from alert to laser-focused, like a wolf rediscovering lost territory. He didn't need GPS. No signs. He led the way ahead of the car, sometimes pausing, veering off along trails that only he remembered. "You've been here before," Ethan said, part realization, part awe. Bruno didn't look back, but he did stop for a moment, then continued forward, as if nodding in confirmation. And Ethan understood. Maybe this was the last place Bruno had seen Marcus Keller. Maybe he'd once been dragged here for a final test, and then abandoned, left to carry the weight of that memory for years. He didn't need to bark to tell the story. Every step he took was a testimony. Dusk fell quickly, like a heavy curtain, covering the remnants of the old path that led to Cedar Ridge. Amidst the shadows and gnarled roots, Bruno came to a halt. He didn't bark. He simply lifted his head and touched his nose to a thick curtain of ivy clinging to a moss-covered stone wall. Ethan stepped forward, gently pushed aside a rotting branch, and froze. Behind the ivy was a metal door, rusted but still bearing faint military engravings. The door stood like a silent mouth in the heart of the forest. No light, no sound, only a damp chill exhaling from within, like the breath of a well forgotten by time. Ethan placed his hand on the handle, but didn't open it. He turned to Bruno. The dog sat quietly, like an old sentry rediscovering his final post. "You sure about this?" Ethan asked softly, even though he knew Bruno couldn't answer with words. But Bruno looked at him, steady, unwavering, as if he had known this day would come, and he had been ready all along. An hour later, back at the station, Ethan reviewed the security camera footage from Pine Hollow, the site where they had found David Rourke buried alive. Every file had been wiped clean. The recordings were replaced with hollow data. No images, no movement, just a cold message on the screen. File not found. Ethan clenched his jaw. Someone had accessed the system remotely. Someone powerful enough to tamper with internal security and erase evidence without leaving a single trace of code behind. Bruno lay beneath the desk, his coat still matted with dirt and dried mud from the forest. But Ethan wasn't looking at the grime. He was staring at a small stitched seam on the reflective vest across Bruno's chest, a seam he was certain hadn't been there before. "Bruno," Ethan whispered, kneeling down and gently reaching under the fabric. The dog didn't resist, just looked at him with calm, waiting eyes, as if he'd been holding on to something, ready for this exact moment. Inside a hidden pocket, sewn with precise care, Ethan's fingers touched something hard and thin, a memory card. He drew it out, a black micro SD, unlabeled. Bruno couldn't tell him when he'd found it, where he'd hidden it, or why, but Ethan had worked with this dog long enough to know Bruno never held on to anything without a reason. He inserted the card into his laptop. The screen flickered. A single folder appeared. Inside, just one video file, raw format, uncompressed, as if pulled directly from a K9 chest cam. Ethan clicked play. The screen lit up with jittery footage, starting from Bruno's perspective, running over dusty ground, barking, then turning to look at Ethan as he detected something near the abandoned livestock pens. And then, Ethan digging with Bruno whining as he caught the muffled cries beneath the dirt. The exact moment Ethan's hand touched the dust-covered sleeve of David Rourke's uniform. All of it, recorded in full. Ethan fell silent. System files could be erased. Military reports could be falsified. But the eyes of a dog never lie. And Bruno, without telling anyone, without even being asked, had kept this footage, had waited, until it mattered. "You thought of this before I did," Ethan said, voice thick with emotion. Bruno gently laid his chin on Ethan's knee and closed his eyes. A quiet gesture, but one of absolute trust. And in that moment, Ethan understood. This wasn't just a partnership between a man and a dog. This was a bond beyond language, beyond duty, like how Bruno had sensed the threat in the ash-gray sedan, like how he had hidden the memory card, instinctively, without command. He always understood, sometimes more than any human ever could. That same night, Ethan sent a copy of the video to an old colleague, now an investigative journalist, with a single note. "If I don't check in within 48 hours, release this footage." Then he turned to Bruno. "We're going in." Bruno blinked once, no tail wag, no bark. But Ethan knew he was ready. There was no doubt left. Bruno understood this wasn't just a mission. This was redemption. A promise that the past would not be buried again. The next morning, sunlight seeped through the thin living room curtains like a faint suggestion of peace. Something Ethan knew all too well he would no longer easily find. The evidence was in hand. The gates of Cedar Ridge had been exposed, and Bruno still lay at the door, eyes open, as if he had never slept. Ethan sat on the chair, holding a cup of cold coffee without knowing when it had gone cold. He stared at a name in an old notebook, marked in red ink from years ago. Luis Vega, former Homeland Security agent, Independent Task Force 2017 to 2019, resigned. Address: Lake Haven District. No phone, no social media. In person only. No one from the old intelligence unit ever mentioned Vega. His name felt like a ruin, something both feared and deliberately forgotten. Bruno walked over, gently nudging Ethan's knee with his nose. No bark, no signal, just that look, that gaze that said, "We should go." They left Pine Hollow near noon, the road west stretching past quiet little towns where time seemed to only exist in the sound of Sunday morning church bells. Lake Haven wasn't in any travel guide. It had nothing of note, except for one thing. Luis Vega lived there, and hadn't left since the day he vanished from the administrative map. His house sat deep in the woods, backed by rocky slopes, facing a still lake veiled in a thin mist. When Ethan stopped the car, Bruno stepped out first. No barking, just slow, cautious steps, as if he could sense the difference in this place. Ethan knocked. No answer. Then a raspy voice came from inside. Not loud, but clear. "Come in. Don't stand out there like you're not traveling with a dog that can read a room." The door opened slowly. The man who faced them was thin, his silver hair unkempt, dressed in an old shirt and faded slacks. But his eyes, they still had the look of someone who had stared straight at the truth and lived to tell it. "You're Ethan Cole," Vega said. "And that's Bruno." Ethan paused. "How do you know his name?" Vega didn't answer right away. He pointed to an old wooden chair. "Sit. The dog can lie wherever he wants. But I suggest you keep him close. The stories I'm about to tell might chill both man and beast." It took nearly half an hour for Ethan to show him the video from the memory card. Vega watched without blinking, his face carved with stillness. When it ended, he closed the laptop and pushed it back toward Ethan. "You've got a good dog, not because he found someone, but because he knows how to keep a truth buried, until it needs to surface." Ethan said nothing. Bruno sighed and shifted his position, resting his head on Ethan's leg. "Project BHC," Vega began, "stands for the Black Hallway Corridor, a program initiated by Homeland Security in 2009. Officially, it existed only on paper for the first 8 months. Then it was handed off to a private contractor for live testing, with the goal of automated combat behavior via psychological triggers. "Arctis Global," he continued, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might listen, was the primary contractor. They built a network of testing camps scattered across the northern mountains, under the guise of rehabilitation centers for wounded veterans and retired K-9s. Ethan nodded, tension in his voice. "David Rourke was one of the test subjects?" Vega let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You still call them people? They were injected with emotion-suppressing drugs, deprived of sleep, and locked up with recorded screams playing 24/7. Some developed extreme defensive reflexes. That was called success. The rest, those who became depressed or lost control, were labeled unfit." Ethan felt his hand tighten into a fist. Bruno had now lifted his head, eyes wide, locked on Vega. It was like he could smell something familiar and unpleasant. "How many were there?" Ethan asked. "No one knows the real number." But in the final phase of my investigation, I identified at least 19 cases of internal disappearance, including David Rourke and Marcus Keller. But when I tried to go public, the files were pulled, the case was shut down, and I was forced into early retirement. Ethan frowned. So you don't have any copies? Vega looked at him in silence for a long moment. Then he pointed down, where Bruno was lying. I once believed no one from the corridor could escape it. But when that dog walked in here, I knew I was wrong. He's alive, still fighting, and still protecting people even after people nearly took his soul. Bruno didn't move, but Ethan could feel his breathing slow, purposefully, like he was holding something back. He remembered. Bruno was part of the corridor? Ethan asked. Vega nodded slightly. Maybe he didn't have a code number, but I once saw footage of a German shepherd breaking out of isolation after sensing blood from a soldier screaming down the hall. No one trained him to do that, but he did. And then, his file was erased, because in the corridor, compassion was classified as a system flaw. Ethan lowered his head, hand resting on Bruno's back. No words, but his heart pounded with unanswered questions and a wordless respect. Bruno wasn't just a companion. He was a living witness to what they had tried to bury. The late autumn wind howled through the trees behind Vega's wooden cabin, carrying the scent of dry pine and lingering ashes from the old fireplace. On the table, a black and white photograph lay carefully placed in a chipped wooden frame. In the slanting light of dusk, every detail in the image seemed to breathe. Young faces, hollow eyes, and a tall man in the center, imposing, powerful, yet his face hidden behind a cold, metallic mask. This was the first and last test unit ever documented before the corridor was officially shut down, Vega said, his finger brushing the photo's edge. After that, everything went dark. Ethan sat still, eyes locked on the masked figure. Something about the man's posture, the way he stood, even how he rested a hand on the head of the German shepherd beside him, sent a chill down his spine. That dog, dark coat, strong frame, and most distinct, a crescent-shaped mark of darker fur beneath the right ear. Bruno. He was sitting right next to the table, head tilted, staring at the photo like it was a mirror reflecting buried memories. His body tensed slightly. No growl, no bark, but his eyes, sharp as blades. He recognized someone in that photo. He remembers, Ethan whispered. And he was there, Vega confirmed, his voice low and piercing. I don't know how Bruno survived, but his existence is proof of what they did to both man and dog, turning them into tools, test subjects, and then erasing their names. Ethan nodded, still fixated on the masked man. Deep inside, a sharp ache was rising, a broken sense of familiarity, like he'd seen that stance before. The slight lean to the left shoulder, like it had been injured. The eyes behind the mask. Who is he? Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. Vega gave a single name. Mallory. Ethan repeated the name in his mind like a frozen echo. Richard Mallory, a name he vaguely recalled from an old case file, once praised as the architect of psychological recovery programs for veterans, now vanished from the government registry. Mallory was the top commander of the corridor, Vega explained. No one knew his full background, only that he had unrestricted access and total authority at the test sites. Rumor had it he was a war strategist in multiple conflict zones, with deep ties to Arctis Global, the same corporation behind many Black Ops programs. Ethan squinted. And now? Vega opened the second drawer, pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside was a thick stack of documents and an old satellite map. He pointed to a red circled coordinate. The Center for Invisible Wounds Therapy, located on the northern slope of the Broad Pine Hills. A perfect cover, Vega said. A treatment facility for PTSD veterans, licensed, media coverage, even celebrity donors. But behind the scenes, it's a blueprint to reactivate the corridor, and Mallory is in charge. Bruno stood up. No command needed. No waiting. He walked toward the door, then turned back, eyes on Ethan, alert, intense, but with an unshakable trust in them. Ethan rose, hand instinctively resting on Bruno's head. A breath escaped him like wind through broken ruins. "We'll bring him into the light," he said. Back at the hospital, Ethan found David Rourke. In his hand was a print of the original photo. Mallory in the center, masked. David, more lucid now but still weak, looked at the picture, lips trembling. He pointed to the half-covered face. "That's him. He was the last one I saw before they injected me. He told me, if you're still awake, it means you're not weak enough to die." Bruno approached David. He slowly laid his muzzle on the edge of the bed, not touching the wound, just lying there like a vow. David trembled. "I thought he was our savior. He said he'd help us beat the fear. But what he did was kill us, one piece at a time." "Not all of you," Ethan said gently. "You're alive. And so is Bruno." David looked at Bruno for a long moment. In his eyes, a flicker, like a memory rekindled from fire and ash. "He's the one who growled when I collapsed. Mallory ordered him isolated. He feared him, because he refused to attack me." Bruno didn't react, but he closed his eyes, as if to affirm, "That is true." That night, in his room, Ethan recorded everything. Mallory's name, the Arctis Global Link, the therapy center's coordinates, David's confirmation, the photo, the footage. He glanced at Bruno, lying under the desk, eyes open, refusing sleep. Still him, the companion, the one who carries truth on his back. No one knows. No one speaks his name. But he is the living soul of all they tried to bury. And now, the masked ghost had a name. Ever since the name Mallory had been spoken aloud, the air around Ethan felt different. Every footstep in the police station hallway echoed like someone was counting them. Every unfamiliar glance from a colleague made him alert. Not out of suspicion, but because he knew. The news had gotten out. The photo of Bruno lying beside David, the footage of him saving a buried soldier, and a single chilling caption: "The dog who carries the memory of a buried project." No one knew who had sent it, but within 12 hours, it was everywhere. The media dubbed him the scarred dog who tells the truth. News outlets recreated his story as a hero's journey. Independent journalists, bloggers, and investigators began digging into the old corridor files and into Ethan's past. He didn't care about the comments, didn't answer interviews. The only thing he did every day was check Bruno's armor, change the safe's passcode holding the memory card, and look into the dog's eyes to remind himself, "I can't afford to slip." That day started like any other. A cardboard box was delivered to the front gate of the station, wrapped in brown paper, no sender listed, only a hastily written note. "For Bruno for what he's done." Inside was a large dog bone-shaped biscuit, wrapped in wax paper, along with a simple card, a small gift from a mother whose child went missing. Ethan picked it up, turning it over. No obvious signs of tampering. A colleague chuckled. "Looks like Bruno's got fans now." Ethan hesitated briefly, not wanting to alarm everyone. He placed the biscuit in Bruno's food tray in the break room, where the dog usually went after shifts. Bruno looked at him, tail wagging gently, then grabbed the treat out of old habit. No one expected what happened 30 minutes later. The sound of a metal bowl crashing to the floor echoed into the main office. Ethan sprinted out, heart pounding. The first thing he saw was Bruno, lying on his side, legs twitching, eyes wide and unfocused. A smear of white foam lined his mouth. "Bruno!" His shout froze the entire station. He couldn't remember how he lifted him. Couldn't recall driving to the nearest animal emergency clinic. Only that Bruno was still breathing. Weakly, but alive. And that was the thread keeping Ethan from falling apart. The ER doors shut. Ethan stood outside, numb. His fists were clenched so tightly they bled. Over and over he whispered to himself, "I should have known. I did know." Then something strange happened. Amid the chaos, while the vet pumped fluids and administered antidotes, Bruno, though unconscious and fading, twitched an ear every time Ethan called his name. He wasn't fully under. He was fighting it. Hours later, the vet emerged. His coat was stained with dried blood, and the air was still heavy with antidote fumes. But his eyes were calmer now. He's going to make it. We got to it in time. It was a modified toxin, not immediately fatal, but it targets the nervous system and shuts down organs within an hour. Whoever did this knew working dog physiology well. Ethan collapsed into the chair. And then, he cried. Not the way an officer mourns a fallen partner, but the kind of cry buried deep in the chest of someone afraid they're about to lose family. He got up and walked into the post-op room. Bruno lay on a steel table, breathing softly. He was regaining consciousness, eyes still closed, but his ears fluttered faintly at the sound of familiar footsteps. Ethan sat down, silent for minutes. Then he leaned in close, whispering, for the first time, a truth he had never said aloud. "You're not just a dog, you're family." Bruno stirred. His eyes opened slightly, and in that moment, in the sterile gray room filled with the smell of meds, Ethan understood. Love needs no words, only loyalty that doesn't quit. That night, as darkness settled over the hospital halls, the only sound was the IV ticking like a sorrowful metronome. David Rourke jolted awake in the middle of a fading dream. No dust, no stench of rotting soil, but the voice still lingered in his head. Marcus's voice, hoarse, afraid, yet heartbreakingly quiet. "If one day I'm gone, tell them I wasn't insane. I was just scared." A sentence David had carried like a stone in his chest for 3 years. That stone had sunk deepest when he was buried under rubble and mud, barely breathing, his mind unraveling. But it was also that sentence that kept his soul from slipping away. He hadn't dreamed of death. He'd dreamed of the last time he saw Marcus. It was a gray morning inside the Corridor's training facility. They had just finished 3 days of isolation in the White Room, a psychological torture chamber where time was erased. No clocks, no windows, just pale lights and constant high-frequency white noise. David had curled up in the corner, eyelids swollen from sleep deprivation. Marcus, the quietest member of the group, sat upright in the center, eyes distant, like he could already see the end. "David," he'd said, "if I disappear, don't let them rewrite me as a lunatic. I wasn't crazy, I was just scared." "Scared of what?" David had asked. "Scared that one day I might start believing they were right, that I was something that needed to be erased." They never saw each other again after that. David opened his eyes. The hospital ceiling was blank, but its emptiness reminded him he was still alive, and that he owed Marcus a promise. Sweat drenched his forehead and back. He started to sit up, but then he felt it. Something warm brushing his wrist. A head. A breath. Familiar brown eyes were watching him in silence. Bruno, the German shepherd, still recovering from his poisoning, had quietly left his room and found David's, like there was some invisible thread between 2 survivors of the same hell. Bruno didn't bark, didn't wag. He simply lay there, resting his muzzle on David's arm like an anchor between dream and reality. That silent touch said more than words ever could. David whispered, "You remember, don't you?" Bruno blinked slowly. "You were there. You saw it. You heard Marcus cry." David looked deep into Bruno's eyes, and for the first time, he didn't see a trained working dog. He saw a companion soul, a witness carrying the lost memories of those no one remembered. "Bruno," he said softly, his hand trembling as it touched the dog's thick fur. "If I can't speak, if I disappear again, you have to speak for me. You have to let the world know Marcus didn't break because he was mad. He broke because his faith was crushed." Bruno lifted his head and lay it fully across David's arm. It was heavy, but not a burden. It was a vow. The next morning, Ethan stepped into the room. He'd just visited the vet's ICU and realized Bruno was missing. But he wasn't surprised to find him curled next to David, eyes open, on guard, standing watch. "He refused to stay put," Ethan said, walking in. David gave a tired smile. "He's keeping a promise, for both of us." Ethan sat beside the bed. Morning light crept in through the blinds. He pulled out a photo, the Corridor team photo Vega had given him, and pointed to the half-masked figure. "We know who Mallory is." David's face darkened. Then he pointed to another figure, smaller, in the back row. A young face, but old eyes. "That's Marcus," he whispered. "They erased his name from the files. But I remember those eyes. Eyes that had seen hell and still chose not to betray his friends." Bruno didn't move, but his gaze deepened, like a sealed memory had just been stirred. Ethan nodded and pulled out a folder. "I found an old address. One more person from the corridor is still alive. Greg Harper. He lives in isolation with severe PTSD and was treated at the same therapy center Mallory now runs." David gripped Ethan's arm. "Go, find Gregorian. If he remembers, he'll confirm everything I said, everything Marcus endured." Ethan squeezed his hand. "I will, but I won't go alone." He looked at Bruno. The dog was already standing, still weak, but no hesitation in his stance. He would go for Marcus, for David, and for a promise no one asked him to keep but one he chose to honor. That morning, when Ethan put on his old tactical uniform, the one he had stored away for years, something in the air cracked ever so slightly. Even the quiet hospital room where David lay seemed to slow, like time was holding its breath. Everyone knew. The steps Ethan took today would not be the same when he returned, if he returned at all. Bruno lay by the door, still not fully recovered. Injection marks still patterned his belly, and his breathing sped up every time he tried to stand too quickly. The vet had advised at least another week of rest. But Ethan knew what was building behind Bruno's brown eyes wasn't instinct. It was duty, a silent promise that couldn't be left unfinished. Ethan crouched, gently touching the dog's chest harness, and whispered, "Are you sure, Bruno?" No bark, no whimper. Bruno pushed himself up with all the strength he had left. His stance was shaky, but his gaze did not waver. "Let's go," Ethan whispered, not just to the dog, but to himself, the man stepping across the final line between light and shadow. The drive to the unnamed therapy camp was silent. Bruno lay in the back, head resting on Ethan's old backpack. During the entire 2-hour trip, he didn't sleep. He simply stared out the window, watching the thinning tree lines turn into thick, brooding forest, so dense and dark that even sunlight seemed afraid to enter. The name Arctis returned to Ethan's mind like a curse, a corporation veiling countless unauthorized experiments under the guise of mental health treatment. This therapy center, as Vega had pointed out, was their final, perfected disguise, an experimental zone masked as a place of healing for PTSD-stricken veterans. But Ethan knew, those who entered this place weren't there to be healed. They were there to disappear, in mind, and sometimes in body. As the car turned onto a dirt road winding through the forest, Bruno perked up. Ethan noticed the shift in his eyes. Not ordinary alertness, but something deeper, a memory. As if Bruno had smelled these woods before, heard these rustling pines, maybe during a past mission, or worse, during a rescue gone wrong that he had never forgiven himself for. As they neared the camp gate, they didn't go in directly. Ethan cut the lights and stopped nearly a kilometer away. He removed his weapon, attached the suppressor. Not because he planned to shoot, but because he'd learned. Where the worst things hide, the silence is always deceiving. Bruno needed no command. He stepped out, inhaled deeply, and began leading the way with his instincts. Each step was measured, not from pain, but from calculation. Every leaf crunch, every whisper of wind, was analyzed through a wordless memory. Under a thin sheet of snow, Bruno paused at a small, deep footprint. Off balance, as if left by someone with trembling legs. He sniffed, gave a soft whine, then looked back at Ethan. "Greg?" Ethan guessed. Bruno didn't confirm. He simply followed the trail. Not long after, they reached the edge of the camp. From afar, it looked like a peaceful retreat. Cozy wooden cabins, warm yellow lights spilling from windows. No gunshots, no electric fences. Everything was too perfect. A trap wearing tranquility. Ethan raised his infrared binoculars. At least 10 figures were moving, none in medical uniforms. Some carried stun batons. Others had concealed firearms under winter coats. Near the camp's left side, by a frozen lake, Bruno stopped again. He sniffed, then scratched the ground lightly. Ethan moved closer, crouched, and found a muddied scrap of patient fabric. A name faintly visible. G. Harper. Something clenched in Ethan's chest. They were closer than anyone had ever dared to get. Bruno sat, eyes locked on a single, isolated cabin at the far end of the row. Ethan didn't need words. Bruno was saying, "Greg is there." The night thickened as they circled to the cabin's rear. Ethan unlocked the door with his tools. Inside, darkness pressed in, sterile antiseptic laced with damp decay. In the corner, a gaunt, silver-haired man curled up like a child. Bruno entered first. No bark, no growl. He simply stepped forward and sat, his gaze meeting the man's like a fragment of the past come to life. The man, Greg Harper, looked up. His wild eyes froze when they landed on Bruno, and then, as if a trap door had flown open inside him, he broke into tears. "Room 8, he stammered. "I never forgot." Ethan clenched his fists, and Bruno, though still weak, remained by Greg's side, steady, like a pillar in a crumbling memory. Greg trembled as he pointed to a corner of the room, where the old wooden wall looked unremarkable. But behind the faded paint lay a narrow doorway, just wide enough for someone to slip through crouching. Ethan shone his flashlight close, and only then did the faint marks emerge. Tiny scratches, fingernails, sometimes dried blood. The ones trapped here had not left quietly. Bruno stayed close to Greg, reading every twitch of the old soldier's face. Each shaky breath was another shard of the hell about to be revisited. As Ethan gently pulled the hidden door, a cold, damp draft wafted from the stairwell below. Bruno paused, lifted his nose, and gave a sharp breath through his teeth. Not a growl, but a signal. Ethan understood. Something wasn't right. Bruno sensed it, but they were too close now. And Greg, his eyes filled with fear and resignation, stepped downward first, like returning to the grave of his mind. They had only gone down 8 steps. "Ethan, back!" Bruno lunged without warning. A sudden clang rang out, metal striking metal. Ethan hadn't processed it yet when Bruno slammed into him, knocking him backward into the hallway. Then came the explosion, a sharp, dry boom, not cinematic, not drawn out, just a flash of white light and thick gray smoke erupting from the stairwell. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Ethan hit the floor hard, ears ringing, disoriented. But one thing cut through the haze. Bruno's breathing, labored but alive. He stood in the smoke and falling dust, one ear torn open, blood dripping down his coat. One front leg was bent, trembling with pain, but his eyes, still sharp as steel, locked onto Ethan, then Greg, who stood frozen, shell-shocked on the stairs. Bruno understood without being told. This wasn't just a trap. It was a message, a cold, calculated warning. Do not proceed. But Bruno didn't stop. He stepped toward Greg, even though the pain made his shoulders sag. Ethan rose, aching, meaning to stop him. But Bruno turned his head. His eyes weren't pleading. They were resolute. "I can still walk," those eyes said, "and I will go first, because if I don't, you might not make it." Bruno wasn't an invincible soldier. He wasn't a superhero. He was just a dog, bleeding, half-deaf, no longer young. But he chose to go forward, not from command, but from belief in what was right. Ethan stood, eyes burning. He followed Bruno, weapon in hand, knees stiff from the fall. Greg still shook, but when he looked at Bruno now, there was no more fear, only awe, as if he were seeing the one who had once dragged him back from the abyss. They entered room 8, a corridor of endless gloom. Scratches lined the walls. On the floor, discarded patient gowns still bore numbers. And then, the first sound broke the silence. Not voices, but a soft, rhythmic chime. A distant bell, ringing steadily, like the heartbeat of an invisible watcher. Bruno turned. His eyes lit up. A low growl slipped from his throat, not of fear, but warning, defiance. Ethan placed a hand on his head. If this is the last trap, then we face it together. Bruno didn't react, but his eyes said, no. If someone must fall, it will be me. Not you. For the first time, Ethan felt smaller than a creature without words. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew. Despite being the officer, despite once being the guide, it was Bruno, poisoned, scarred, barely standing, who was truly brave. They pushed deeper into the darkness. Step by step, Bruno led the way. Blood dripped behind him, but his eyes burned brighter than any light in that cursed room. In the final room of the underground prison, where ghosts were caged, the scent of rust and rot hung thick in the air, like it had seeped into the walls. Ethan quietly buttoned his tactical jacket, his headlamp flickering like the dying heartbeat of those who'd already survived despair. Greg trembled behind him, afraid to even breathe. And Bruno, though still limping from the explosion, walked silently ahead, eyes glowing like a flame that refused to go out. The door creaked open, cold, sharp. Then a voice rang out, familiar enough to make David's grip tighten around his gun. "David Rourke," Mallory said, voice low and composed, as though welcoming an old guest, not the one who had just torn down every mask he'd worn for years. He stood there, a dim light casting his shadow long across the wall. The face was still recognizably his, but time had ravaged it, a scar cut from cheek to neck, like a permanent stamp of guilt carved into skin. David didn't respond. He simply stepped in, gun clenched tighter. Mallory raised a hand, not in surrender, but like he was presenting a chessboard. Behind him, a steel door with biometric locks. According to Greg, it led to the ones still alive, those who had once been Marcus, Greg, David, before the black hallway crushed them into nameless shells. "Are you here to end me?" Mallory asked. His gaze was sharp as steel, yet his tone was smooth as silk. "Or are you here to choose something else?" From his pocket, he pulled a memory card. The original. The one Bruno had quietly picked up in the rubble and guarded until the moment was right. It held the irrefutable truth. Video of David tied down, injected, buried alive. "This card," Mallory said, flipping it lightly between his fingers. "If made public, I lose everything. Arctis Global crumbles. My name burns in headlines. But what about you, David? If you take it and walk out, the others stay locked in forever. No one will save them." The air thickened. Ethan stepped back slightly, eyes flicking to David. Mallory smiled. "Your choice. I unlock the door, you save them all. But the card gets destroyed. No justice, no press, no truth. Just a silent act no one will witness." Silence. Bruno growled low, not a threat, but a presence. Then he stepped forward. No one ordered him to move. No one told him what to do. But Bruno positioned himself directly between David and Mallory. No bark, no snarl. He simply stood, embodying the center of two choices: justice or mercy. David looked into Bruno's eyes, the same eyes that had pulled him from the grave 3 years ago, that had guided him through nightmares with no map. Bruno couldn't speak, but he was asking, "Do you want to be right or be kind?" David's hand loosened. Without a word, he threw the gun aside. Ethan gasped. Mallory flinched, but Bruno didn't move. His eyes never wavered. David charged toward the biometric panel beside the door. In a flash, Mallory reached for his weapon, but Ethan was faster, slamming his arm down. The gun clattered to the ground. David smashed the safety glass with his bare hand, blood streaking down onto the keypad like a final baptism. He punched in the override code, etched into memory from years past. Beep, beep, biometric confirmation. The lock groaned. Cylinders whined like the final scream of a monster unmasked. Inside was Marcus, emaciated to a shadow, eyes hollow, mouth trembling. But when David wrapped his arms around him, Marcus clung back, whispering the only words he had left. You kept your promise. Bruno stepped forward. He sniffed each survivor, licked Marcus's forehead, then leaned against Greg's hand, recognizing his pack again. His legs trembled from pain, but his stride was steady. Mallory broke free from Ethan's grip, but now there was no one left to fear. The room was empty. No more shadows to hide in. Bruno looked at him, not with hatred, just the stare of a soul that had never bowed to cruelty. A dog, limping from a bomb, poisoned, once broken, once blamed, yet still choosing to save. Smoke and dust still hung in the air as David carried Marcus out through the last steel door. No one looked back. There was nothing left to see in the darkness that had held them too long. Outside, the sparse forest opened into a clearing, a path to freedom. But the wind through the trees still smelled of memory and pain. Bruno was the last to leave the building. He walked slowly, each step heavy with wounds and silent ghosts. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just that limping gait, head lowered from exhaustion. But those eyes never dimmed. Greg shouted when he spotted helicopter lights overhead. Floodlights swept the forest, catching glints of blood on David and Marcus, and lighting up Bruno's matted coat like something sacred. The beat of the UH-60 Blackhawk's rotors thundered down. Dust flew everywhere, as if heaven itself had descended. Ethan shouted over the wind, "We have wounded 4 people and 1 4-legged fighter." The medics rushed forward, stretchers, trauma kits, and confused eyes taking in the scene. A soldier in a torn, ancient uniform clutching a starved teammate. A man shaking from cold and shock. A police officer pressed tight to a bleeding war dog. And all of them are alive. "Dear God," a medic whispered, staring at Bruno. "Head trauma, ear torn, leg injury. How is he still walking?" "Because he didn't choose to leave anyone behind," Ethan murmured, holding Bruno close. He walked for everyone who couldn't. Bruno rested his head on Ethan's chest as they lifted him onto the stretcher. Gauze wrapped his chest, already dark with blood. A doctor administered morphine, whispering comfort as though Bruno understood. But Bruno didn't sleep. He blinked slowly, checking. Was Marcus on board? Was Greg still here? And David, the man he'd dug up from frozen earth, was he standing? Only when all were accounted for, when the engine roared and the cabin sealed, only then did Bruno close his eyes. Ethan leaned down, his hand over Bruno's chest, feeling the soft, flickering beat of his heart. For the first time in his life, he cried for a comrade who never spoke a word. "You did good, warrior," he whispered. "You don't have anything left to prove." David sat across from him, eyes locked on Bruno. He reached out and placed his hand over Ethan's wrist. No words, none needed. The shared look between 2 men buried by the world said it all. It had all begun with a dog, wounded legs, and an unbreakable heart. A medic nearby asked quietly, "He's a K9, right?" "Not just a K9," Ethan replied. "He's the last one who never turned away from the truth." Greg sat between Marcus and David, utterly drained. But his hand held tight to Marcus's skeletal fingers, hands shackled in silence for 3 long years. "He got us out," Greg said. "Not the law, not the guns. Him, a dog who knew that life isn't something you leave behind." Bruno exhaled. A breath like forest wind, so faint it nearly vanished. But to Ethan, it was the last echo from the deepest chamber of loyalty. The helicopter lifted, rising above the fake therapy camp, once the stage for twisted experiments in warrior mind reconstruction. Below was forest, shadows, names long erased. But in the sky, a dog rewrote the ending. Bruno didn't need medals. He didn't need fame. He didn't fight to be known. He simply did what was right. And doing what was right saved a soul from hell. Maybe more than one. Not long after that fateful helicopter flight, the air in the U.S. Capitol grew heavy, not with politics, but with a truth about to be spoken to the world. Hundreds of reporters packed the hallways, lenses flashing toward hearing room number 6, where the American flag and the seal of the Department of Defense hung, this time unable to mask the gravity in the room. When the doors opened, every camera swiveled toward a single figure, Officer Ethan Cole. By his side was not a lawyer, not a spokesperson. It was Bruno, his legs still bandaged, his ear folded from pain, but his eyes sharp, unwavering. He didn't walk fast. Every step was slow, measured, like a silent declaration amid the buzz of humanity. No one spoke as Bruno was gently lifted onto the long bench for special witnesses. He didn't need to speak. The way he raised his head, rested his muzzle on Ethan's leg, and stared directly at the committee. That was truth in its purest form. Marcus sat on the right. His hands still trembled, but the fear was gone from his eyes. In a hoarse voice worn from 3 years of silence, he gave his testimony. They injected us, forced us to stare into lights and listen to torture noise. They called it therapy, but they were training us to be tools. When I began to fear, they didn't help me. They hid me. The room tightened with breath held in. Next, Vega presented a series of documents long buried. Internal memos, images of torture equipment, payment orders between the Department of Defense and Arctis Global, the Shadow Corporation funding the Black Hallway Project under the euphemism of warrior psychological reconstruction. But what silenced the chamber entirely was the video, the one Bruno had hidden in his vest and carried through fire and poison. Grainy, shaky footage, but undeniable. David Rourke, bound, injected, dragged into darkness. The face behind the mask, Mallory, cold, unmoved, now exposed beyond the shield of rank. Ethan was the last to speak, not with rage, but with belief. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because of a warrior, not me, him. He pointed to Bruno, who still lay calmly at his feet, eyes still like a quiet lake. Bruno found David, protected the memory card, guarded us from bombs, from poison, from a silence that lasted 3 years. Without him, there would be no today. Inside that room of stone and symbols of power, for the first time, a dog made an entire nation reconsider its definition of heroism. The next day, every major newspaper led with the headline, "The Four-Legged Warrior, K9 Bruno and the Buried Truth." The media storm was instantaneous. Special reports, investigative documentaries, national broadcasts, all uncovering the Black Hallway Project, the arrest of Mallory, captured in a military hospital, and the collapse of Arctis Global under congressional investigation. In military court, David Rourke's honor was restored. His name, once erased from official records, was reinstated. Not voluntarily missing, but forcibly detained, living witness of misconduct. Bruno, though unable to speak, was awarded the Gold Medal of Valor, the first in U.S. history given to a non-active duty dog. The ceremony was quiet, but when the commanding officer knelt and placed the medal around his neck, Bruno lifted his head and nudged the officer's hand, a gesture of thanks, not for glory. Amid the firestorm of exposure and justice, only one thing remained unchanged: Bruno's gaze still unbowed. When the cameras shut off, when the media's questions finally faded, when justice had become not just a slogan but a real, visible act, Bruno remained. Not in front of podiums, not surrounded by the press, but in a much simpler place, at Ethan's feet, head resting against his pant leg, eyes half closed. The Gold Medal of Valor had been awarded, along with a formal declaration from the Department of Defense naming Bruno as an honorary K9, instrumental in the exposure and rescue operations of a federal civilian emergency. But to Bruno, nothing had changed. He didn't bite the bullet, didn't bark with excitement. He simply tilted his head when Ethan leaned down and whispered, "We're home now, buddy." From that day forward, Bruno no longer wore his reflective vest, no longer carried a mission leash. He was retired, just as Ethan had promised. But there was one thing Bruno never stopped doing: standing guard over the sleep of those he loved. Each night, when Ethan closed the door, Bruno would quietly walk over, circle once, an old habit, and settle at the foot of the bed. His ears always turned toward the door. His eyes could close, but his hearing, trained by war, sharpened by trauma, missed nothing. On some nights, Ethan would jolt awake from nightmares, cold sweat pouring down his face, fists clenched in the bedsheet. And every time, Bruno didn't bark, didn't scratch at the door. He simply walked over, placed his nose into Ethan's open palm as if to say, "You're still here, and so am I." To the world, Bruno was a living symbol, a hero etched into national records, into museum walls, into school curricula. But to Ethan, to David, to Elena, and those whose lives he had touched, Bruno was the silent witness to unconditional friendship, a wordless symphony easing the ache of long years lost. One late autumn afternoon, the city held a public tribute for those who had helped expose the national scandal. On a simple wooden stage in the center of the memorial park, when the name Bruno was called, the crowd of hundreds stood and applauded. At the heart of the park, a bronze statue had been placed. A German shepherd standing tall, not snarling, not submissive, just standing, as Bruno once had when facing down silence armed with cruelty. The statue bore only one line. Bruno? He did not speak, but he never stayed silent. When Ethan walked Bruno to the base of the monument, every eye followed, not out of curiosity, but gratitude. Bruno didn't understand what the medals meant. He didn't need to, but he recognized the one thing that mattered. Ethan no longer carried a gun, no longer feared the dark, no longer whispered apologies every time Bruno winced in pain. He understood, and so he lay down, at the foot of his statue, as if to say, "Nothing more is needed. We did it." By March, when the last snow finally melted from the northern slopes of the city, the wooden gates of a small center tucked behind the pine woods quietly opened. There were no banners, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies, just a hand-carved sign posted beside a sun-worn white fence. Snow Haven Recovery Center for souls not yet at rest. David Rourke and Elena laid the foundation, not with concrete or money, but with memory. Neither spoke much about what had passed, perhaps because it hurt, perhaps because words were no longer needed. But in their eyes, people understood. This center wasn't just for healing wounds of war. It was for preserving the pieces of humanity that the world once abandoned. Bruno often walked the grounds in the early morning. Though the scars on his body had faded, his gait remained slow, slightly tilted. Whenever he paused beside a new arrival, a veteran whose hands still shook from broken sleep, Bruno would gently rest his head on their knee. No demand, no push, just presence and staying. No introduction was needed. Everyone knew who he was, the dog who once saved a buried squad under a top-secret program. But here, no one called him K9 or Warrior. They called him something simpler, something softer. The Keeper of Silence. Marcus Keller, once saved by Bruno, had now moved into Snow Haven. His room stood next to the art studio, where he painted each morning, surrounded by pine wind and the smell of fresh paper. On a rare visit from Ethan, he welcomed his old friend in and pointed to an unfinished canvas on the wall. It was a strange portrait. A German shepherd standing in a dark forest, his eyes glowing as if burning through the night. Behind him lay the shadow of a fallen man, blood staining the forest grass. There was no gore, just a gaze and stillness. Marcus smiled faintly and pointed to the inscription in the lower corner, "The One Who Did Not Fear." "Why that title?" Ethan asked, his hand unconsciously resting on Bruno's head, the dog now lying beneath the chair. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He dabbed another stroke of light into the dog's eyes, then said quietly, "Because he wasn't afraid of the dark. Not because he didn't see it, but because he chose to walk into it, to pull others out." Ethan was silent for a long moment. That sentence sounded like a eulogy for the hundreds of souls broken by war, forgotten for wounds no one believed. and Bruno, a dog who had never read a single philosophy book, had brought them home. That afternoon, in the garden, Elena placed a new wooden bench beside the budding lavender. The backrest was engraved, deeply but gently, with a single line. "Stay, even if no one calls your name." And later that night, as the pine trees whispered and the veterans slept in peace for the first time in years, Bruno returned to his usual place, beside Ethan's bed. No more missions, no more alarms, just a dog who had walked through hell, now resting in a small piece of heaven he helped build. By the following April, the Pine Hollow woods were a shade of green so deep it almost felt unreal. The first spring winds rustled through the branches, not with cold, but with something gentler, as if nature itself was whispering back to the world. On a small hill, where morning sunlight always found its way through, stood a new stone statue. Not tall, not bronze or gilded, just a rough-hewn block, sculpted by a young veteran at Snowhaven, one who once said, "Only silence is strong enough to carve a dog like Bruno." The statue was placed at the very spot where Bruno had once stood, pawing at the rubble, barking into the earth, as if he heard something the rest of the world could not. He stood upright, spine slightly arched in a defensive posture, ears alert, eyes looking far, not fierce, not proud, just aware and full of trust. Etched by hand beneath the statue, a simple line, "For the souls who never gave up, and the barks that spoke for justice." During the memorial ceremony, there were no long speeches. Ethan wore a white shirt, not his uniform. Elena laid a bouquet of lavender at the base of the statue. Marcus stood a few steps back, carrying a small replica of his painting, "The One Who Did Not Fear." No one said much, but everyone somehow felt Bruno's presence, not in stone, but in the way no one looked down when his name was mentioned. Ethan would later share that the night before Bruno passed, the dog still managed to step out onto the porch and lie next to him, eyes on the sky. His vision had faded, his legs trembled, but his tail still wagged when Ethan whispered, "Sleep now, buddy. It's all okay." Bruno didn't bark a final time. He simply exhaled, as if to say, "I've heard enough, I've said enough." Weeks later, canine academies across the country added a new lesson, distinguishing between reflex and instinct. Bruno's story was used as a living example of a dog who didn't just obey, he followed conscience. Bruno was no longer just a warrior. He had become a symbol. And Pine Hollow, a place once forgotten, once buried in pain, was now a place where every bark is heard, not as an alarm, but as a calling from the depths of truth. Every spring, the children of Snowhaven are brought up the hill, where they sit around Bruno's statue. They're not afraid of him. They place their small hands on the stone, lean in, and whisper their innocent dreams. "I want to be a police officer. I want to save people." The adults watch in silence, never interrupting, because they know, between those carved ears, there still echoes the voice of a soul that never gave up. Some stories don't need many words to touch the heart, just a loyal gaze, a bark in the silence, or a gentle nudge from a dog who refuses to give up. Bruno wasn't a superhero. He had no cape, no flashy lines. But he, a quiet canine, was the one who unearthed buried truths, lit the path to justice, and, most importantly, healed souls that once seemed beyond repair. If you've ever witnessed a dog change someone's life, share that story with us in the comments, so that brave barks like Bruno's will never be forgotten. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like the video, share it to spread the message, and subscribe so you won't miss the next moving journey, because sometimes the hero we need doesn't speak, he just stays.